On today's More Than a Test, we have the researcher, the expert, the educational enthusiast, Michael Horn. I dare you to go Google his name right now, because what you'll find is a plethora of articles on everything from kindergarten to college and everything in between, and how we should be reimagining schools. It was a really fun conversation because he let me ask everything I've ever wondered about. How should we change our schedules and our grading and our systems and our buildings? And he had an answer for it all. And so it's really inspiring conversation, really exciting. And I'm so glad that he's here. Thanks for joining us on More Than a Test. Michael, thank you so much for being here today.
My absolute pleasure. It's great to be with you.
I have to tell you, I have a little system when I'm reading your books and your articles, is I like to read them with things like David Laborie or Larry Cuban, because a lot of what they talk about is how school hasn't changed in so many years and that it's really hard. And then you come in just full of hope and we can do it, and it's time to reimagine school. So tell me a little bit about that for you.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when Clay Christensen, who was my mentor and got me into this field, he wrote his first book called The Innovator's Dilemma. It was basically if you're wildly successful and you do everything right, you ultimately die because the upstarts come in and upend you. And then he was like, well, gosh, that's kind of depressing. So when he wrote The Innovator's Solution, as he said, his goal at that point became, okay, how do I put the venture capitalists out of business? Because the companies are going to be able to reinvent themselves and catch those disruptions. And I kind of see it the same way with a lot of my education writing, which is yeah, the cards are really stacked against reinvention. I love David and Larry's research. I think it explains so much. And frankly, I think our theories reinforce a lot of what they say. And yet, that can't be the answer, because our kids, they deserve a better education. They need progress. We need progress as a society. And I think there's a lot of examples of us actually seeing reinvention or innovation with existing schools, and certainly new schools as well. And so I admit I'm not always as optimistic as my writing, but I try to, that's sort of one of the main purposes of my writing, is to help them figure out how to do it.
Okay, give me an example of a school reimagining or reinventing that you really like.
Oh boy. So there's some great school districts that have launched micro schools, for example, in their midst during the pandemic. I love Iron County in Utah, for example, has done some really good work to launch new schools that are personalizing learning, that are mastery based, and really turn things around. And it's interesting, a school like that, they've had some hiccups, right? Where they came out with a mastery based report card, and the parents were like, what the heck is this? And so they had to really rework it with the community. But they said the principle of every student succeeding before they move on to a new concept, that's the thing that's going to stay. And so I think that's a great example of a school both innovating, but then being able to take a blow, if you will, and sort of adjust. Because that's a lot of what Larry and David write about, is how the grammar of schooling is unchangeable. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of forces that are acting to sort of hold that back. And I think that's a good example of one that did it, got hit with those grammar of schooling, and then was able to actually find a way through.
It's so interesting. You brought up a couple things for me. The one thing is this concept of, parents got something they didn't know and they were like, no, thank you.
Yeah.
Which I think is a lot of what we hear. And I'll tell you, the Fort Worth ISD superintendent said to me once, she said, Laura, everybody wants scores to go up, everything to get better, but nothing to change. And I feel like that's the real struggle for schools. What do you think about that?
I think that's exactly right. It's parents say, well, why doesn't it look like what it looked like when I went to school, right? That was what rigorous schooling looked like. I think a lot of educators, they sort of say, well, if we just shut the doors and kept the parents out and just did what we could do and focus, we'd get the results we want, right? And so and everyone sort of has their pet peeve, right, that they want to hold on to. And the reality is a lot has to change for us to get those results. But to your point, people want to hold on to that one thing and somehow magically, think that the system's going to do something different. The really important thing about all systems is they produce the outcomes that they are designed to produce, right? And so that the outcomes we see from students, whether you're looking at achievement or the projects that they do or exposure to careers or the building of social capital, whatever the thing you care about is, we get exactly the results that the system is designed to get. It's not that people are doing a bad job. They're acting exactly as the system is designed to.
It's like you put them on a path and then you're surprised they followed the path.
Exactly. Right. Like, I mean, and this is the story I love to tell. Is it's not loving to tell, but when Thomas Jefferson imagined US schools way back, right, he was writing in his papers of Virginia papers, and he said, we want a system that is going to sort out like a third of the students by some grade, so that they can go in the farm, right, and be the workers, right, and then we're going to sort out the next third, and they're going to basically be the managers and sort of property owners, and then we're going to have this thin slice of students that are going to go on to college, and they'll be the political leaders and so forth of the world. You take that, like, that's what we've built, a system that sorts people out, right? The dropouts, that's actually part of the design, because it turned out in 1920, if you didn't complete high school, there were still good jobs for you on the other end. You go to college, right? Some students drop out of that. Turned out not a big deal in 1920 again. You could get great jobs in the middle class. That actually was true until the 1970s. And now the world has changed, but our education system is still largely pumping out the same results.
That's great. I really appreciate that. One of the things I hear you say over and over, and that I've seen in your books over and over, is this idea of mastery learning. And I think that this has kind of been, in some circles, it's like jargon terminology, and in some places they really deeply understand it. So tell me a little bit about what you mean for mastery learning, and tell me what the smallest step a school could take to be on the way to mastery, moving to like mastery learning.
Oh, great questions, both. Okay, so when I talk about it, I mean students don't fully move on from a concept until they've demonstrated mastery of it. And you get to define what mastery is, you get to define how they exhibit that. But the idea is like, no, they really understand it. They can really show evidence that they understand it. And it's not like a 1 out of every 10 times, right? It's something north of 8 out of every 10 times. Like, they can show that they've really mastered this. Now, I think a lot of people, when they hear that, they think, well, some kids are going to be stuck forever on some concept that they don't care about in like 9th grade biology. I think we can have a little bit of elasticity where we say, hey, so-and-so, like, that's not a concept that they really are passionate about as they get older and older. And that's okay. But we're not going to give them like an incomplete grade or a C or something like that for that. We're just going to show that they have never mastered that particular concept. And that's the big idea, is that you don't get to move on from a concept or say you've completed it unless and until you show mastery of it. And so that makes, in effect, the time variable and the learning constant for each individual student. That's a big shift. Now, how can schools actually start to move in that direction? It's tricky, let's be honest. I think elementary school is the easiest place to do it, because there is less of a sense that, hey, I'm a biology teacher in 9th grade, I teach biology, right? Oh, you're ready for chemistry? Well, too bad, we do biology here, right? And so I think high school, it's a lot trickier, given that we've had very defined areas of subjects, and people thinking that my job is to get through the content, not necessarily make sure everyone masters it. But I think in elementary school, there's a lot more elasticity around that. We have this sense that everyone should master the fundamental skills of how to read by 3rd grade, right? That's a great example where we've got a few years there to play with to make sure every single child actually has the skills to do that, right? They can sound words out, they have fluency, they can have some comprehension, and then they can start reading to learn and build the knowledge base that actually creates great readers in the longer run. But let's be like ironclad about, like, we're going to make sure you master that, and we're not going to let you just sort of move on without that mastery. I think that's an easy place where we can start to be ironclad about it. And by the way, I think most kids can get it by 3rd grade, given the tools that are out there now at our disposal. I mean, obviously the work that you all do is, I think, huge testament to that. But I think we could do that with math, some basic mathematics as well for younger kids. Like, they should be able to master that. And we're going to be ironclad that, like, no, we're not moving on to double-digit subtraction before you've mastered double-digit addition. We're going to actually make sure that you understand that building block concept.
That makes sense. There's a school in New York, in Mineola, that it's a tiny little district, but they've done a lot of work on this. and their kids have these, and you're 100% right. They started in elementary school. The kids have these mastery books where they get stamps when they've mastered a skill. And then they can also choose skills to master. And in order to be like mastered in that, they have to teach someone else what they learned. So
Oh,
that's,
wow. Because that really shows, yeah, that's really cool.
yeah, it is. It's a neat concept for sure. I'm not surprised that this is where our conversation went because so much of your writing is there. But I also read your book, Reopen to Reinvent. And the way it was like, it's sold on Amazon is it's a blueprint for like reimagining schools. But if you read it, it's a blueprint with like 1,000 things you could do to reimagine schools. I mean, we could talk about
Yeah.
schedules and grouping and individualized learning and mastery based learning and school purpose. If you're a school or district, a leader, and someone, and you really do have an interest in reimagining what you're doing, for whatever reason, your scores aren't good, kids aren't happy, whatever it is, what would you say? Like, you can't do it all. No one can do it all at once. What
No.
would you tell someone as a place to start? A thought, how do you start?
Yeah, honestly, I would pull out a small group of educators that have some frustration with the model and allow them to start designing what a quote unquote new school within a school might look like a micro school within a school within a school, a particular grade level, and let some parents and students opt in to that new model, so that they are basically co-builders or co-designers with those educators of what you're doing. And to your point, I wouldn't go through my list and say like, okay, we're going to do all those things you just named. Instead, I would say like, okay, let's start with the question: what do we want our students to know and be able to do at the end of this? Like, what's our North Star, right? And then start to make a series of design decisions from that optimize your chances of reaching that for all the students you serve. And I wouldn't force every parent or student into that micro school. I would just allow it to start to, have that first year with students opting in. See if you can make it successful. You're going to have to prototype a little bit, test and learn. Not everything's going to work, but you got a bunch of parents that have opted in, excited about the vision, hopefully. And then, as I like to say, success breeds more people getting excited and interested in something. You can then grow it the next year, not ever saying to parents, you're all going into this right now, but one by one. Earlier, I was having a conversation with the superintendent at Mesa Public Schools in Arizona. They're doing some fantastic work there, reimagining schooling. And it was super interesting. They talk a lot about team teaching. They were working with the next education workforce at Arizona State to create team teaching for teachers. And she was talking about that. And she was like, we have a bunch of schools that like it's actually anathema to their design to do team teaching. So we're not expecting them to do it, but all the other schools we are. And then parents are making these choices, right? Do I want to be in the Montessori school? Do I want to be in the school without the team teaching? Do I want to be in the traditional school with team teaching, right? And you can start to make those choices and not impose it, but you're creating a really coherent educational model that parents say like, I've embraced that vision and that reinvention.
Well, and I think that's such interesting data too, right? People are then voting with their feet of where they choose to go to school based on what you're offering. And you can see, both what's working with the data and then also what's working with the community. So that's an interesting,
Exactly.
I think that it's so lovely to hear that right now, because so much of what I hear from districts right now is we're all going to do the same thing. Like what next year, fidelity is the goal, right?
Yeah.
And so it's nice to hear that, like, let's do some fidelity, sure, but let's also do some experimentation and offer some options and opportunities.
Well, I actually, just for quick, this isn't where you wanted to go, but quick heartbeat. The I think one of the reasons a lot of parents and students are leaving districts right now is that instinct around one size fits all. We're all going to do the same thing is actually driving certain pockets and communities out of the schools. And to me, that one size fits all sort of mindset or instinct of a lot of leaders of schools has actually worked against their efforts for improvement, for innovation, for like all the things. I think it's actually worked against them, but it's one of the biggest blockers or barriers to this sort of rethinking what schools look like to allow all students to soar.
Is that what the data is showing us? Is that people are leaving traditional public schools right now? Is that the enrollment? I know in my area it's like that, but some of that is population and some of that is just we have a preponderance of private schools.
Yeah.
But is that what you're seeing nationwide?
Yeah, we are seeing it nationwide, particularly in the biggest urban districts, right? And then obviously there's a whole bunch of states that have created education savings account policies that allow dollars to follow students to different schools of choice, and so that's driving it as well. But I think the biggest reason in my mind is that parents are saying what the traditional district is offering is not meeting the needs of our kid, our family, what progress looks like for us. And so they're starting to move away. It's why I think you see so much drain from New York City and elsewhere right now, is really around sort of this is the way school works sort of mindset.
Okay, I want to get back to that, but I want to ask a couple more questions about like what you would recommend because again, I love reading these things and I love thinking about ways to do schools differently. Part of the reason I work at an ed tech company now was I actually really loved the moment in COVID when we were all asking, like, okay, what do we do? Like, let's throw everything out and see what we come up with. Like every week we tried a new design. And I
Yeah.
enjoyed that. I found that really fun. And so one of the things I saw in one of your articles is like, basically your call to action after COVID was like, let's not go back. I feel like we've rubber banded back pretty quickly.
I
How do you
agree.
how do you feel?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, honestly, this is why I said like I have my pessimistic moments despite some of my writing. And I'm largely dismayed by what I've seen from schools and districts. I feel like the rubber band analogy is the right one. Most places have snapped back to what they were doing, or maybe even more command and control than they were before, to your point, because they're trying to get some order. They're trying to deal with chronic absenteeism, declining population, whatever it is, teachers that maybe don't want to be teaching there, et cetera, et cetera. And I think they've tried to sort of hold on to things as they were. Um, which, to be clear, like that's perfectly predictable. Whenever you see a threat, like that's the instinct of an organization, is to say we got to go command and control, lock down, do what we've been doing. But it's the wrong instinct. And I would say where I'm optimistic is I do see lots of educators leaving the system and creating new schools that do things differently. I see lots of people moving to these other options through education savings accounts and the like. And I think it's going to create a very different looking, public education system in the long run. But I think it's pockets of hope and innovation that are allowing certain families to have progress. And my hope is that it starts to cause a lot more superintendents to say, hey, wait a minute, we don't have to be the only ones left out of the party reinventing. Let's get into that as well.
That makes sense. One of the areas that I feel like maybe we did change is the idea of like individualized learning, right? We went
Mm-hmm.
from, kids sharing iPad cards to every kid has a device.
Yeah.
And we had to meet with kids one-on-one because they were at home, right? There was only so many opportunities for large classes. Do you think we've made some gains in individualized learning and how do you feel about that?
Yeah. I guess I think we made some head nods to it, but we haven't done it enough. So the way I think about it is we have the infrastructure now in place to do that, but we actually haven't rethought the models as much as we should. And so we've like layered over tutoring on top of the existing system, but it turns out like you don't meet with the same tutor every single week. So it's not really high dosage tutoring. Or yeah, everyone has the tablet or the laptop or whatever it is, but you're still constrained in sort of this top down, one size fits all, march along in the same pace model. And so we haven't actually thought about how do we actually redesign the learning environments so that we can create the right elements of personalization and create the right opportunities for collaboration where kids can have fun with their friends while learning, which I think is an important motivator. You may have seen there's like a really interesting article in Education Next a few weeks ago where they looked at math software, and it was really interesting. Khan Academy, iReady. I'm just blanking on a few of the names right now, but there was a bunch of them. They all have amazing studies of efficacy, and every single one of the studies shows that only 5% of students use them at the minimum dosage.
Right.
Right. And so to me, partially that's like we've got to do a better job of motivating lots of different students with lots of different interests. But part of that is also we are not working enough with the educators to create learning models that actually say like, no, like you're going to get your 3 times a week, minimum 20 minutes or whatever it is, right? To actually like do some heads down time on this math, right? Or with Amira, whatever that time is that you want them getting tutored in effect, right, on Amira, on their reading, that we make sure that they get that. And then, yes, all the other activities around that software component that are more collaborative, that are more small group, et cetera, they're going to be strengthened by that foundation. And we make sure that everyone's getting that dosage.
Okay, I'm going to agree and disagree with you, and that I'm going to say yes. This is like one of the biggest things we work on at Amira is like how do we give teachers everything they need to be able to use it in their classroom in the way that like we recommend, right? To get that fidelity usage, make sure they have that time on task. We know that kids reading out loud makes a huge difference with a tutor. It's a huge difference, but they have to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I will tell you the opposite story I recently heard. I was in a school in New York, and a teacher was showing me 2 emails that were sent within a week of each other. And it said, these are the programs you need to be using with fidelity. And once we looked up, Amira was one of them, all the fidelity, like what that would look like for a kid, right? And then they had another email the same week that said, but kids should not be on screens for more than 45 minutes a day. There was no way to do both of those mandates. As a teacher, there was no way to meet all of the asks of the programs and only have kids on screens for 45 minutes. So I think in some ways, the fidelity problem that like Amira has is fair for the teachers because they're being asked to do the impossible. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, so I think this is a classic case of us sort of having this top-down compliance mindset, right? Around we're going to hit a certain number of minutes as opposed to the outcomes. To me, the leadership should be focusing on the student outcomes we want to see. And we should have a really grounds up, educator by educator, school by school, what's the right instructional model and what's the right set of resources in that model to make sure that you're making the progress. And the teacher could say like, hey, we actually, for this student, we don't see value in a particular program because they've already mastered the set of things that like this program's really good at teaching. Great, they can do other things during that block. But I guess my argument being, let's like really help them get the block of time to make sure that there's room in the schedule for whatever individual supports that each individual child needs. And then let's figure out what the right learning plan is for each individual child. If like, okay, what's the curricular supports you're actually going to be using? Because I do think that's part of this also is like, we have a lot of schools with like, 200 ed tech tools in them. Obviously 190 of those are going to get crowded out because of the realities of time. So it doesn't do much to say like, well, we purchased it, you better use it.
Right.
Instead, we ought to be thinking coherently across the instructional model first, and then plugging the software into the model.
That makes sense. One of the things that I feel like this kind of hits on is a schedule, right? Like, so how do we find the time, right? And one of the things your books advocates a lot for is like reimagining the schedule. And I was surprised after COVID that we didn't come away with reimagining the schedule to give teachers a little bit more flexibility, right? Like during COVID, we had to find a way to give teachers more flexibility because their kids were at home with them and they were trying to teach. There was so much going on. And I was so surprised that we came back and went right back to those 8-period days. If you could imagine what's a schedule one that you've seen that you love? And then 2, what's a creative way that we're not thinking about schedules just because it's not what we're used to?
Yeah. So on the first one, I love the way Summit Public Schools does their schedule, that they have, a block of time when you first come in where you can do some heads down, personalized learning time. You're working across the learning content that you're trying to master. And then it goes into a 2-hour project chunk, right? Where you really have some open time where you can work with classmates on whatever the project is that you're making progress on. And they have a humanities block in essence, right? And then you go into another hour of personalized learning time. And then you have another 2-hour block in the day. And then they have some other blocks for reading or PE or things like that sprinkled through, but it's not, they've completely broken out of the 7-period day. So that's one I would cite. I'll just give you one other, which is like, I love the Montessori school model where you're all in the classroom and like, you've got a 2.5 hour or so work time, right? You can heads down work cycle. You're getting through 3 projects or so. Some places do a Pomodoro learning cycle where it's like 25 minutes head down and then 5 minutes up. But something like that, where it's actually driven by the student, then what they're doing. And the teachers are jumping around saying, okay, look, you 3, you're ready for this lesson on fractions. We're going to all team up right now and jump into that. And you're able to do it because the curriculum is, and the work, right, it comes out of the learning materials themselves, much in the same way software works, right, for some of these things. And there's also lots of room and freedom in the schedule to create those collaboration blocks and things, or opportunities for, my kid to jump over to another kid and say like, I did that last week, let me show you how I figured it out. So those are two examples there. I would say in terms of your second question, one of the most creative things I think that I've seen is honestly like the teacher teaming to free up blocks of time, right? So again, Mesa Public Schools, say you have at least 2 teachers responsible for a roster of students. Theoretically, it's a little bit more than that. And part of their team is also the reading specialist who's going to come in for a certain block of the day. Part of that team is when they say, hey, we need to have like an engineer who doesn't work in schools be part of our team to provide some support for students on this question that they're grappling with right now. And they look out and they're like, okay, we got this several hour block of time. How do we use it with these, 100 students or whatever it is on the ground with this team of several teachers? They can get much more creative then around that, and you're not sort of imposing a master schedule on top of them. So I actually think that's one of the best ways to do it. And you can say like to a particular teacher, hey, you need some heads down time right now to just get feedback out for kids, or you want to be thinking about this awesome lesson you're going to deliver tomorrow in science, because like that's where you really get excited. Let's say this is elementary school. I'm more of the social studies, English language arts, whatever. I'm going to go heads down on that later on today, and you'll jump in for me at that point. So you sort of create teachers you give teachers a lot more autonomy to figure it out with each other.
That makes sense. I'll tell you one of my favorite, you didn't even mention it, and I thought you might, but one of the things I saw recently at a private school here in Denver, they rotate their day. So the kids have an 8-period day, but like on Monday you have period 1 that you start, but on, Tuesday you start with period 6. And their point there is that if you're like a kid who's not a morning person and you always have math in the morning, you're always left behind. You're always kind of in a bad place. And the things that they've seen around student health and happiness, just from like changing up the schedule, that we aren't like married, like so much of what we're like preached to in teacher prep programs is like kids need structure, kids needs like to stay the same all the time. And the reality is like actually kids might be okay with some flexibility, but what they don't need is math at the time they're not the best every single day. So
yeah, that's interesting.
I really thought that was neat, and I really love to see things like that. All right, I want to ask you one more thing that I read about in your book, and I don't know why, but for some reason it really stuck with me this week when I was reading it. It was something that Carol Dweck said about, and I think this goes back to the mastery-based learning, but like kids feeling judged by their teachers. That the point of going to school is the judgment of whether or not they're good and good enough at these things and what their grades are. And it's not about learning anymore. And I would love for you to expand on that. And also like, what do we do? Because I have, you and I have talked about this. We both have twins. I have 4-year-old twins. They'll be in kindergarten in a year. And I lose a lot of sleep over them judging my very different twins. So tell me a little bit.
Tell me about it. Tell me. I was gonna say you're also, they're still under 5, so you're losing sleep for lots of different reasons, I suspect. But so yeah, the way I think about it is this, right? That the current model of learning in classrooms assumes your teachers grade you, but then it creates this like really weird conflict where now the teacher who's supposed to be your coach and supposed to be your cheerleader and get you across the finish line to learn everything you can. And like no teacher wants a kid to fail. But at the end of the day, end of the week, end of the year, they're grading students on a scale where they're saying what percent in effect that you got right or wrong in the given curriculum, right, over the course of, that period of time. And then some of those teachers are going to go on to write your recommendations for college. Now we're talking high school, right? And they're going to be asked on a form, was this student in the top 1%, 5%, 10%, 50, et cetera, right, of your students? So like you're literally pitting your students against each other. You're judging them at various intervals, and the students know that, and the parents know that. And so now you've created an adversarial relationship where instead of like parent and teacher trying to figure out what's best for this kid, parent comes in and is like, I can't believe you graded my kid unfairly, right? And so And so now we have lots of like adversarial relationship there. And the kid's sitting there feeling like, I don't know if, he or she really has my back, because I also know that they're going to be judging me at various intervals around how well I did, as opposed to just like helping me learn the material. And so the basic idea is, and by the way, actually, there's one more thing that's become clear to me also. Grade inflation in this country at all levels, certainly college, but at all levels, actually makes it hard for that teacher to even be honest about what you've actually learned or not, which creates a ton of dishonesty in the system where kids don't actually know what they've mastered or not mastered. They're not sure what they're good at or not good at by the end of high school. Parents don't get a clear signal either, right? Certainly in college, we have tons of students that are passing classes that think they're awesome at everything and like they haven't actually learned the material. So it's created a lot of weird incentives on all sides of it. And basically the argument that I'm making is, well, maybe teachers just shouldn't grade grade their students. Like we should have a separate set of faculty, still humans. AI could help, but it's still humans at the end of the day, that give the final so-and-so, so-called grade to say, have you mastered this or not? And Western Governors University does this in higher education. They have a completely different set of faculty that does the grading on a mastery scale of individuals. But I think you could do this in any scale, frankly, just to break that conflict of interest, break that sabotage that Carol Dweck writes about, and create, reduce the stress between teacher and parent and student that I think drives a lot of acrimony and sort of unfortunate lack of cooperation.
It's so interesting. I just read this article in the New York Times Magazine about, a teacher was saying, I don't let my kids use AI to write their papers. Should I be using it to grade it? And I love that you kind of brought up this. There is an opportunity here to have maybe a more objective party. If you can't afford outside people, to have a more objective party telling you, hey, this is what I would give this paper, or this is what the score is here. It's not up to the teacher who's doing the coaching. It's really interesting. It's not something I thought about at all. And I find that just super fascinating, this idea of, can we like take away the judgment between teacher and student? Because I think you're right. I think it is very much hurting that relationship. It's interesting you brought up grade inflation. I swore to myself I was going to switch talking about you, which I will soon, but I have to ask about the grade, just because as someone who like follows all of those, the videos on Instagram and things like that of kids telling you about where they got accepted and rejected, right? And all of them have GPAs I've never heard of. I know I'm old, I'm not that old, but like some of them, it's like 5.98. I'm like, how? I thought we were grading kids on a 4
scale. Yeah.
Right. How did this happen? And from your research and what you know, and is this really as big of a problem as at least social media is making me feel like it is?
Yeah. So I think it is a big problem. I think it's one of the big reasons we have, such a reliance on SAT and ACT, right, for college admissions, is that, and I think something interesting has happened also there in the research, whereas, 20, 30 years ago, grades were more predictive of student performance in the first year than were your test scores. That seems, based on the colleges going back to the SAT and ACT and based on the research that they're citing, that seems to have changed. It seems to be that the test scores are now more predictive. I'm not saying they're super predictive, but they're better than zero correlation, right? And they're better than the grades, and the two together are the best of all. But I think it's not that the tests have gotten better. That's for sure.
Right.
So I'm pretty sure it's that the grades have become less meaningful. And you see this across, you see this across high school. You see this, there's lots of studies in colleges that have shown the average grades over time have gone up. And one of the arguments is like, well, like a place like Harvard, right, is accepting incredibly prepared, talented students. And it's like, on the one hand, maybe, but on the other hand, we know that they're actually studying far less than they did a generation ago as well. And it sort of strains the imagination to believe that, and faculty report this all the time, that they feel a pressure to give good grades because they don't want the complaints either. And those dynamics are true in K-12 schooling as well. And we know from a lot of parent surveys and the like, that parents think that their kids are on or above grade level in a way that does not match at all what the state tests are telling us about where their kids are as well. And so I just think we're seeing this big disconnect open up right now. That's creating a problem. And in terms of the GPAs that you're talking about, you take honors AP classes, right? All the things, you get more points for these classes, on top of the fact that it's very unlikely you're going to get a grade below a B in some of these places. It's really hard to know what they actually mean when you look at them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I do want to talk about you because it's so fun to read your books and think about like someone who really wants to make a change. But when I think about the conversation we've been having for the last 30 minutes, is that there's a lot of, I don't know, dismay and disappointment. I think you and I are both really disappointed at how little things changed after COVID. Teachers seem unsatisfied. I'm sure this would be a lot easier and a lot more lucrative if you did it for like Coca-Cola or anyone else and help them reimagine change. Tell me about like why schools mattered so much to you and why you tread this road so heavily.
Yeah, it's a good question. I know what my personal like mission statement is, right? Like when I get up out of bed every morning, like I want to make a world in which all individuals can build their passions, fulfill their potential, and live a life of purpose. Where did that come from? I had a public policy writing background before I went to business school, to your point, to not Coca-Cola, but like to get away from it all. I took this class with Clay Christensen, changed the way I saw the world. And he had this opportunity to co-author a book with him on public education. And I think at the end of the day, like after 9/11, that's the generation I am in college. I really wanted to make a positive impact on the world. And money was never something that I thought would make a ton of. I've made far more than I ever imagined I would make, frankly. And so I'm fine, right? Like that's not it's not the driving force. I'm stumbling a little bit to answer it, but I guess I would say it's two things. I think after 9/11, it really changed my perspective. I wanted to make an impact to positively help us make progress as individuals in a society. And then number two, having that opportunity to write Disrupting Class with Clay, co-found the Clayton Christensen Institute. And originally when we signed up to work together, he was like, it'll take a year to write and then you can do whatever it is you actually want to do. And I'll call any CEO in America to help. It's like, oh, that sounds good. Well, the book took 2 years to write. And then I had an opportunity to go lead a media company in Asia. And my wife and I, we were dating at the time, but we talked about it and we were like, this is what I'm like. I'm so passionate about what we've just put on the page. I want to see this happen. Like, this is what I need to be doing. And I guess I'd say like, there's obviously some down times and down moments, but there's never a day where I wake up like not incredibly animated by the purpose and like getting excited to work, because I hope somewhere that I'm making a difference for, one more educator, one more entrepreneur that's going to unlock more progress for kids.
Okay, I feel so bad because you're so optimistic and I'm going to kind of like bring you down one more time, but I just read in the New York Times that far fewer students at like especially the top tier colleges are choosing a life of service. That they're the new mentality, I think the article said like the numbers are clear. Kids all want to go to, work in banking and things like that. And then the other piece was the mentality is I need to make the money first, I'll make a difference second.
Yeah.
What would be your response to that?
Well, so I guess a couple things. One, I'm not someone that believes that any career path is holier than any other. I think we can all make a difference in society by creating more prosperity for individuals. By I believe like people who go work for Apple, they're providing a great service because they're unleashing products that make our lives more enjoyable and simpler and better. And I feel that way across it. So I'm not holier than thou. I guess is what I would say, number one. But what I would say number two is I think a lot of people have this mindset of I'll make the money and then I'll figure out how to improve society. And I guess I would say life's pretty short, number one. And I would much rather you figure out what really lights you on fire, what feels like progress for you, what drives your energy. You can figure out a way to make the money work and get to the point where you need. And let's be honest, like above, $75,000, $80,000, more money's not going to drive much more happiness for you. In fact, it might create more problems. So let what drives your energy lead and then make the money work around that is the way I would think about it. because I know a lot of those. I mean, this was true when I went to college. A lot of kids that went into banking, they didn't know what banking was, and they weren't going to be tremendously excited by the 12-hour days and 7 days a week sort of lifestyle for something that didn't really drive their passion. And then like one of my college roommates, it totally lit him on fire. Like it was something that, financing companies and providing ways to do that, like that really excited him. Well, that's awesome, right? That's great for society when you're passionate about it and you feel like it's making a difference. So I think that's my big advice. The book that I'm working on right now is called Job Moves: 9 Steps for Making Progress in Your Career. And I'll say there's lots of interesting lessons out of it, but number one for me is really know what drives your energy and try to line up as many things in your job as can do as is consistent with that. Because otherwise there's a whole lot of pain on the other side of that. Just being an unhappy individual, that's going to spill over into your relationships, your how you treat your family, your friends. That's not a positive road to live down.
Okay, well, I'm going to tell you the last sentence in that article that I read. It was something
Yeah.
along the lines of like, sure, you can go work for a hedge fund, but just remember that 15 years at a job, you're going to be a different person. So 15 years at a hedge fund, whether, even if you make all the money, you'll be a different person than you would have had you done something different. So I
Yep.
think that's super aligned to what, and I can't wait for your book to come out. I probably, no matter what, I like to change jobs and things like that. And I think it sounds really helpful. Let me ask you one more thing. You're not the first person, you're not the second person, you're not the third person on this podcast to say something about Clay Christensen
Hmm.
being such a huge part of their path.
Huh.
Tell me a little bit, many of us didn't get to meet him before he passed. Tell me a little bit about, why you and him, anything that he gave you that you can give to us, I guess.
Oh boy. Clay was someone who thought in every interaction he had that he could learn something from the person he was talking to. And that created a level of curiosity and humility and kindness in him that I just think we'd all be much better off as a society if we brought that with us into every interaction. And then secondly, Clay, he was a deeply religious man. He was Mormon. I'm not. But he sort of thought a lot about like how he would be judged after he passed away. And he came to this conclusion, and sorry for the long story here, but he came to this conclusion that God didn't need data to make sense of the world. Data was something that humans used to make sense of like a really complicated, messy world. And as a result, he wouldn't be judged by the sheer number of people he had impacted in his teaching and writing and so forth. But that instead, he would be judged by the quality and helpfulness of each of his interactions with every single individual he had interacted with over his life. And I think that really drove him to say, how can I just have utter kindness in every interaction I can do? Sometimes to a fault, right? Like he would just try to help anyone. And it was lovely. And, sometimes naive, but I think it was so beautiful that it's something that we could all, we could all take away in our lives.
It's really lovely. Thank you for sharing that and sharing a part of him. Let me ask you one more thing about school. So, I'm sure we all had that moment in elementary school where we were given a big piece of paper and told to draw our dream house. And
Yeah.
like it had slides coming down every angle. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
I would love for you, like, just take like 2 minutes, draw for us your perfect school.
Oh boy. Well, so it depends on the age level. I will tell you that. But I'm quite. Let me give a couple quick ones. Like I love my kids' Montessori school. They're just finishing third grade. And I love the personalization it creates, but I love the camaraderie and opportunities to develop their habits of success or social emotional learning, whatever you would call it, because it's incredibly driven by the individual, but then the interactions with the community. And I think it's a beautiful thing. I would allow a little bit more digital technology, I think, in it. But I think they do it in a really beautiful way that honors the fact that kids learn at different paces and pathways, have different levels of background knowledge that they bring into learning experiences. and can really learn from each other as well. And they've just cultivated a beautiful joy of learning as a result of that. I'll tell you, in the high school level, I would love to see more places flip the school day. Like, kids don't want to be getting up at 7 a.m. to go to school. It doesn't align with them. Let them get up at 9 o'clock and go to a job for 2 or 3 hours. Like, get out in the community and actually get some real work experience. Have it count for part of their schooling. And then, go into school for a couple hours, do some projects, do your extracurriculars, your band, your school play, school sports, whatever it is. And then go home and take 1 or 2 online courses. I think we should be having far fewer courses at once for kids, because it's awfully hard to like context switch across 7, 8 different subjects at once. What if you were, I'm not saying you should just do one thing, but what if you were doing like 2 or 3 things at once, and really getting to go deeper in them? And then after a month, you get to move on to the next, set of things that you're interested in learning. So I think that's how I would structure that set of experiences.
That's wonderful. All right. Well, the last thing we're going to do today is 5 questions that we ask every guest. And so I'm going to ask you those 5 questions. We call them rapid fire, but obviously answer as you like. The first one is
quicker.
The first one is, the podcast is called More Than a Test, and we call it that at Amira for reasons that have to do with the way our assessment works. But everyone hears that and thinks of something different. So when you heard More Than a Test, what did you think of?
Oh boy. I think when I first heard the name More Than a Test, I thought, yeah, the test is important, but there's so much more that goes into preparing a child for being a successful individual, helping them have a sense of purpose so that they can find happiness.
That's great. A lit moment. And what we mean by that is a moment of you and a book that either changed you or is your happy place or something that you remember.
Gosh, I'll go with How Will You Measure Your Life by Clay Christensen for the book, just because I think it does a really great job of saying, here are the theories of innovation that can make progress more predictable in your workplace. But like, actually the secret to it is how you apply it to yourself. And I'm such a dork that some of the concepts even found their ways into our wedding vows. And my wife and I sort of go back to some of them as saying like, okay, is this the deliberate strategy we had set upon? Is this the right balance of time and so forth? Because as Clay said in that, it's very easy to get, short-term focus by rewards of like, I submitted an article to a publication, or like we shipped a new product or whatever it is. And your kids, as you know, at age 4, like they don't always give you those positive signs, tell you, great job, mom, great job, dad. So how do you sort of make sure that you're deliberately balancing? Because you also know that real happiness comes from the time you spend with them over the long run.
Yeah, exactly. All right. A piece of technology you love.
Ooh, I love my Whoop right now. I never thought I would, but got it on the band, right? So Whoop is it's a band that for fitness wellness. It is telling me that I have not been very good to myself with sleep over the last few weeks. But like I think I've been deluded, because the first 6 months I had excellent recoveries from all my workouts and working days and so forth. But I'm very fitness and wellness obsessed, and so I was skeptical that it would add value, but I've really become an adherent of it.
I don't know. I've never seen a Whoop. I'm going to look it up after this, but I will say, as someone who doesn't like devices and things like that, I'm just like, let me just live my life. I will say, I have a Garmin that when you go on an out and back run, it'll tell you when to turn, so you get home. So like when I'm out in a new city, it has been a game changer for me.
That is really cool. That is really cool. I will tell you, the Whoop, one of the things I like about it is it has no screen or like interface whatsoever. Similar to you, like I found when I tried one watch a while back, like I felt like it was just annoying me with more alerts. I didn't need that.
Right, exactly. The best advice you've ever been given?
Best advice I've ever been given. So many things coming into my head right now. I'll go with something my dad told me freshman year of college when I was going through a tough time on something. And his advice was, you are more me than you will ever know. And this is how I would think about the situation you're in. I turned out to ignore what he said, but I learned a heck of a lot from the basic lesson and framing, and sort of being able to separate yourself from a situation and sort of say like, okay, what would I tell my dad or another character like me to do in this situation, and sort of help guide you in your principles and actions around different situations.
That's really lovely. And like at this exact moment, I'm like, ooh, that is really good advice. And I should really try it for something that I'm working through. So thank you for that. And a book you think everyone should read?
A book that I think everyone should read. Oh, I just said How Will You Measure Life? So I will try to do a different one. Boy, I'll do the Inner Game of Tennis that I'm rereading right now. It is such a great book, not just about, frankly, tennis. There's several versions of it for other sports and other things, but just sort of how to be a little more zen in our lives, and how to learn without our sort of consciousness getting in the way of what we're trying to and trying to impede us as we're trying to make progress. So I'll go with that book.
I can thank you so much. Couple books I haven't read. I feel bad that I haven't read the Clay Christensen one because I've heard him so much. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much for this conversation. I know I said it at the beginning, but you and I could do this for another 4 hours with me just like bringing up random topics about schools and you'd be like, well, this is what I've seen and this is what I know and this is how we should think about it. And I think it would be really helpful. So thanks for your time today and thanks for sticking around in schools. I know all of us educators don't always make it easy. So thanks.
No, I learn a lot. I learn a lot from everyone. And I just appreciate you having me on and the work you're doing.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for joining us on the More Than a Test podcast. If you found this conversation valuable, subscribe to our YouTube channel and find us on your favorite podcast platform. At Amira Learning, we believe every child deserves a chance to become a reader, and we're excited to be part of this conversation. See you next week, and thanks for joining.